Chapter 7. Seba Niles sat on the floor, brushed away dust, then produced an apple from within the long red cloak he was wearing. He split the apple in two with his sharp but clean fingernails and offered half to the boy. Larton wolfed down the fruit. When Seba saw how ravenous the child was, he gave him the second half of the apple too. Taking it with a brief nod of thanks, Larton sat cross-legged like Seba and munched down to the core, chewing the pips and all. "I am guessing that you have not eaten in a while," Seba noted dryly. "I would give you more if I had any, but I do not. You can hunt with me later, or I can bring food back for you if you prefer to remain where it is warm and dry." Larton grunted and picked up the remains of a pip from between two of his teeth. Squinting at Seba, he said suspiciously, "What do you want?" "I do not want anything," Seba replied. "Then why are you helping me? Why let me stay here and give me food?" Seba smiled. "I am simply being hospitable." "You should never call a man a liar unless you are sure," Seba said coldly. "You're living in a crypt," Larton said. "You can't be up to any good if you're staying in a place like this." Seba raised an eyebrow. "I could say the same about you, young pup." Larton chuckled weakly. "I suppose you could." "Why are you here?" Seba asked. When Larton's lips drew thin, he added, "You do not have to tell me, but you look troubled. I think it will rest easier if you are open with me." Larton shook his head. "You first. What are you doing here?" "I often stay in places like this," Seba said. "You sleep in crypts?" Larton asked. "Usually." "Why?" "Because I am a vampire." Larton frowned. "What's a vampire?" Seba was surprised. "You have not heard of the tales? I thought in this part of the world. Have you perhaps heard of the living dead, the walkers of the night?" "Do you mean ghosts?" "No, vampires are—" Seba considered his words. "Hold on," Larton said, a memory sparking somewhere inside his head. "You're not a bloodsucker, are you?" "Now you have it," Seba beamed. "I remember Ver telling me—" "What?" Larton only had a dim recollection. Ver had told lots of tales. It was something about creatures who drank blood and lived forever. "There are many legends about vampires," Seba said. "Most are unreliable. We do drink blood to survive, but we are not killers. We do no harm to those from whom we feed." "A monster who doesn't kill?" Larton was skeptical. "Not monsters," Seba corrected him. "Just people with extraordinary powers. Or weaknesses, depending on how one looks at it." Seba uncrossed his legs and stretched. "I cannot recall my exact age, but I am more than 500 years old." Larton grinned. He thought it was a joke. Then he saw Seba's expression and his smile faded. "All vampires start life as humans," Seba continued. "We turn from the path of humanity when another vampire bloods us." He held up his hands, and Larton saw small scars at the tip of each finger. "My master cut my fingertips, then his own, and pumped his blood into me. That is how I became a vampire." "Why did he do it?" Larton asked. "I wanted him to." Seba explained how vampires aged at 1/10 of the human rate, meaning they could live for several hundred years. He told Larton of their great strength and speed, the codes of honor by which they lived. He explained about the hardships, the way humans feared and hunted them, how sunlight killed them after a few hours, their inability to have children. Larton listened, entranced. Like most of his friends, he believed fully in a world of ghosts and magic, demons and witches, but this was the first time he had been exposed to the reality of that world, and it was far different than he'd imagined. Seba told Larton some of the many myths about vampires. Crosses were meant to frighten them, holy water could burn them, you had to drive a stake through a vampire's heart, then cut off his head and bury him at the centre of a crossroads to stop him rising again. They could change shape and turn into bats or rats. "Oh, rot," Seba snorted. "The hysterical rantings of superstitious fools." Larton had heard some of the tales before, but in relation to other monsters. He asked Seba if they were also real, demons, witches, and the rest. "Ghosts, yes," Seba said seriously, "and witches. As for demons and the like, well, in 500 years, I have not seen any." He told Larton how he had been blooded as a child, and spoke of some of the countries he'd visited, and a few of the famous people he'd met. Larton didn't recognize most of the names, but he didn't admit that, not wanting to appear ignorant. Finally, when Seba felt the boy had learnt enough about the world of the vampires for one night, he reversed the question. "And you," he asked gently, "why are you here, so far from home and other humans?" Larton's first instinct was to make up a story. He didn't want to confess to his terrible crime, but Seba had been honest with him, and Larton didn't want to lie in return. "I killed a man. Larton said hollowly, then told Seba the whole sorry tale. He cried while telling it. This was the first chance he'd had to think about what he'd lost, not just his best friend, but his parents, his brothers and sisters, his entire way of life. But he didn't let the tears overwhelm him. He kept talking, even when it hurt to speak. Seba nodded slowly when Larton had finished. From what you say, that wretch of a man deserved to be killed, eh? And long before he struck the fatal blow. But murder always hurts. It is right that we grieve when we kill. If we did not feel pain, we would kill more freely, and what would the world be like then? I'm evil, Larton moaned. I'm going to hell when I die, or somewhere worse. A place worse than hell? Seba smiled grimly. That would be a bad place indeed, but I do not think your soul is damned. I stabbed Traz to death, Larton said, wiping tears from his cheeks. In the heat of the moment, Seba reminded him, after he had slain your innocent friend. That is not the act of a vicious beast. You don't think it was wrong? Larton whispered. Of course it was wrong, Seba said. You took a life that was not yours to take, and that should haunt you far into the future. But virtually all people do wrong at some point. The truly evil are those who willingly follow the path of violence when they find themselves on it. You have a choice now. You can embrace the darkness within you and become a monster, or you can reject it and try to lead a good life from this point on. What if I can't? Larton croaked. What if I enjoy killing him? Did you? Seba asked. Larton shook his head crookedly, then sighed and nodded. I felt powerful. He was bigger than me, and he'd hurt me, all of us, so much. Part of me wanted to kill him. After I'd stabbed him, I leant forward to poke his eyes out. I wanted to torture him, even though he was dead. But you restrained yourself, Seba pressed. Aye, but it was hard. Seba pursed his lips, impressed by the boy's honesty. Vampires have a way of testing people, he said. We do it before we blood humans. Great power must only be given to those responsible enough to deal with it. If we blooded the weak or craven, they would wreak havoc on mankind. We can taste evil in a person's blood, Seba went on. It should be vile and bitter, but evil often comes wrapped in sweetness. The test is not foolproof. We sometimes make mistakes, but in most cases it's accurate. I can test you if you wish. Larton wasn't sure he wanted to be tested, if the results went against him. I will do you no harm, Seba promised. If your blood is not to my liking, I will go on my way tomorrow and leave you be. Vampires do not judge humans or meddle in their affairs. Larton gulped, then nodded hesitantly. He was afraid of what the vampire might reveal, but he'd rather know the truth about himself than live with uncertainty. This will only hurt slightly, Seba said, taking the boy's arm. Using one of his sharp nails, he made a small cut just above Larton's elbow. As Larton winced, Seba put his mouth over the cut and sucked. For a worried second, Larton thought he'd been tricked, that the vampire planned to drain him dry, but then Seba released and swirled the blood around his mouth. Well? Larton asked as Seba swallowed and narrowed his eyes. An interesting vintage, Seba joked, but Larton knew nothing about wine, so he only stared at the vampire blankly. Seba licked his lips. You have mixed blood. Larton grew cold. Does that mean I'm evil? No, Seba said. There is an underlying sweetness, but it is not overwhelming. I would say you are strong-willed, easily enraged, perhaps bent towards violence more than most, prepared to do bad things if provoked. Of course, we already knew that, given how you acted today. But I do not think the evil strain is dominant. You will need to tread cautiously through life and guide your emotions carefully if you wish to master them. But in my opinion, you can choose good. Larton was relieved but troubled. After today's violent explosion, he wasn't sure he could make those good choices. He recalled the way he had licked his lips, the disappointment that the dark part of him had felt when he stopped short of stabbing out Traz's eyes. I will leave you here now, Seba said, arising. Where are you going? Larton asked. He felt panic at the thought of being left alone in the crypt. It wasn't fear of the dead, but that Seba might not return. I must hunt, Seba said. For blood? No, I drank last night. A vampire only needs to drink a couple of times a week. Less, in fact, but we prefer to drink small amounts often, rather than large amounts rarely. We can control our urges more easily that way. I go to find food now. Like all creatures, we need to eat. You'll come back? Larton asked, trying not to sound desperate. This is my room for the night, Seba said evenly. If I did not care to share it with you, I would ask you to leave. Only a fool puts himself out of his own home. Larton smiled and shivered. Could you start a fire before you go? No, Sid was scolded by the boy. We light fires on occasion, but we do not rely on them. A vampire must be willing to endure discomfort. If you wish to be my assistant, you will need to accept that. You can take off your damp clothes, but ask no more of me than that. Wait a minute, Lyon snapped. Who said anything about me being your assistant? I don't want to become a vampire. Really? Zeba purred. Then answer me this. Where else will you go? Who will accept one of the damned other than a family of the cursed? Where will a creature of darkness hide, if not in the shadows for the night? Damned? Lyon echoed faintly. I thought you said I wasn't... I use the term poetically, Zeba said. In human terms, any killer is one of the damned, but vampires learnt long ago that we could find nobility in the depths of damnation. Zeba rose smoothly and surveyed the boy from a height. I will not force you. It does not work that way. Each person must choose freely, although not all of those who yearn to join are accepted. If you wish to chance the waters of vampirism, it will be many a year before you can be blooded. First you will serve as my human assistant, travel with me, hunt for me, guard me by day, learn from me by night. In time, if you serve well, we can talk about blooding. We do not take anyone under our wing unless both parties are entirely sure that this is what the apprentice wants from life. But you must make your first decision tonight, Zeba concluded. If you wish to learn more about our ways, stay. If you think your path lies elsewhere, move on. I will be gone some hours. If you are here when I return, so be it. He turned to leave, then paused and without looking back said, You do not have to be alone. The world never inflicts loneliness upon us. That is something we choose or reject by ourselves. With that, the ancient vampire slipped away. Lyon stared at the doorway long after Zeba departed, thinking of all he had been told. The day had seemed to stretch on forever until he was almost too tired to focus, but he forced himself to concentrate. He could tell that this was a moment of destiny. If he made the wrong choice, he would regret it, probably sooner rather than later. Zeba had said that Lyon would have years in which to choose. He wouldn't be blooded until both of them were sure that this was the right thing for him. But Lyon knew in his heart that the choice he had made tonight would be binding. If he turned his back on humanity now, it would be forever. Lyon considered his future, thinking with wonder of all the things he would see and learn as a vampire's assistant, thinking with fear of all that he would leave behind. At first he was worried about his other options. If he rejected the vampire, where would he go? How would he survive? But as he thought on it more, he realized that didn't matter. This was all about choosing or not choosing one particular path. He needed to decide if this was the way for him. If it wasn't, he should leave the crypt immediately. Better not to start down a wrong path at all than head down it in the hope of making a detour when something better came along. Lyon wrestled with the problem some more, before ultimately deciding that he should go with what his heart was telling him. But when he was satisfied with his choice, Lyon shrugged off his clothes and sat in the darkness. His teeth chattered, and he shivered wildly, but after a few minutes, he figured that wasn't the way a vampire's assistant should behave. Straightening his back, he fought off the shakes and goosebumps and sat to attention, steady and calm, patiently waiting for Zeba, his master, to return.